Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome back. I've been offline for quite a while, but I'm very glad to be back. So we're gonna get started in the first video of the series. And I think a really good place to start is to go through the neurochemicals and break down what it looks like inside the brain during phenomena like depression and anxiety. Because um, there's a saying that says you can't read the ingredients from inside the jar. So if you're overwhelmed by, you know, something mental that you're currently going through, what's really, really helpful is to be able to break down scientifically and chemically, okay, what's happening in the brain, because then you can say, oh, okay, cool. How do we affect what's happening in the brain, which will then affect our experience um, for the better. So we're going to go through the roles of different neurochemicals. This is a gross simplification, of course, and my understanding in this is still very, very limited. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's super, super complex stuff at the highest level. So um, there's over 100 neurotransmitters that all work in conjunction in very intricate chemical cocktails to produce cognitive experience. However, it is useful to have some basic ground understanding, even if it is limited. And one of the more popular theories currently for explaining depression, especially, but I think it's also involved in anxiety, is the monoamine hypothesis, which um, basically draws correlation between the level of three monoamine neurotransmitters, which are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, linking the level of those to depression, and that in people who have depression, those three neurochemicals tend to be lower, or there tend to be less of them than in healthy individuals. So I think it's useful to break down, each of these neurochemicals, um, because then later for different exercises that I'm going to talk about and different things to implement into your life, I'm going to be linking the effect of those exercises back to the effect that it has on the levels of these three monoamines. So you can see clearly, oh, okay, cool, a cold shower works because, raises norepinephrine or whatever, or exercise, all different things. We'll get onto that. So to start, dopamine. All of these are obviously extremely, their roles are extremely complex in the brain, and this is a gross simplification. But dopamine plays a role in executive function, so that's like decision making, motor control, motivation, arousal, habit reinforcement, and reward. And people with depression tend to have low levels of dopamine, and people with anxiety tend to have very high oscillations between higher and low levels of dopamine. And so, obviously, a big part in implementing practices that are going to have a anxiolytic effect is going to be, okay, how do we neutralize those dopamine levels? The next one, serotonin, plays a big role in mood stabilization and feelings of well-being. It plays a role in allowing the brain cells to communicate with one another and for different parts of the brain to communicate with one another. So once again, very, very complex. Its biological function is multifaceted. It modulates mood, cognition, reward as well, learning, memory, etc. And once again, low levels of serotonin are linked to depression and anxiety. And something interesting just to add about serotonin, because it's going to, make a lot of sense when we touch in on diet and stuff like that, is that 90% of your serotonin is synthesized in your gut. from a precursor called tryptophan, which is found in certain foods. And so, really big part of having, sufficient levels of serotonin is actually making sure you have enough precursor there. And that also raises a whole lot of interesting questions that we're going to get into about the gut-brain microbiome and the importance that your gut plays, which is laced with neurons, by the way, super, super interesting, the role that that plays on your mental state. Thirdly, norepinephrine. So norepinephrine plays a role in a number of functions, also memory, attention, stress reactions, energy level, and the regulation of emotions. So all of these, are involved in the same thing because they often work in conjunction with one another. And low levels, once again, are associated with depression. So all of these monoamines are very, very similar. And now the next part, so that's the monoamine hypothesis for depression and anxiety. And the next part is the neuroplasticity side, because a really big part of, mending depression or anxiety, which are both characterized by, very ingrained self-depreciating thought patterns. So a really big part of it, and the second part now that we're going to cover, is neuroplasticity and the neurochemicals that are involved in that, and how when you start getting onto things which, I'd like to get onto way later, like, the effect of psychedelics on the brain and the effect of meditation on the brain and the effects of, things like that, how they increase and decrease the levels of different neurotransmitters in different parts of the brain, all of which favor neuroplasticity and the ability to rewrite new neural pathways and therefore new thought patterns and new ways of being, ultimately. So the first one we're going to cover is glutamate. And glutamate is a neuron exciter, and it increases neuronal communications between different parts of the brain that don't normally talk to each other, and obviously plays a key role in creating new neural pathways and neuroplasticity. And one that we're going to get onto later specifically is the NMDA receptor, which is very interesting because in some parts of the brain, when it lights up, it's like, oh no. And in other parts of the brain, when it lights up, it's like, fuck yes. And then the other one to glutamate is GABA, which has sort of a opposing role, and that's actually to reduce the activity of overexcited neurons, and it plays a stabilizing role in the brain. And in the context of neuroplasticity, the neurons that it's going to, stabilize and neutralize are going to be those old entrenched patterns that are firing. So it's the simultaneous turn on and turn off in different parts of the brain, which allows new neural pathways to be created. And then thirdly, we've gone through all the neurochemicals now in the monoamine and in neuroplasticity. And thirdly, I think it's just helpful to talk about brain activity. So not so much on a chemical level, but just which parts of the brain are more active and less active during these mental phenomena. So there's decreased activity in the frontal lobe, which is our, human evolved part of the brain. Our frontal lobes are bigger than any other animal, and that part of the brain is associated with things that differentiate us from animals, executive decision making, planning for the future, etc., social, very intricate social awareness, etc. So in depression and anxiety, we see decreased activity in this part of the brain, and then we see increased activity in the limbic structures of the brain, which are behind the frontal lobe. And this part of the brain, also called the rhinencephalon, is found in pretty much all vertebrates, and is referred to as the animal brain for that reason. And it's the brain of emotion, of impulse, and of, avoiding pain, seeking pleasure, like a rat in a cage. No foresight. Then there's also, back to the other point. Although actually, that this is not a neurotransmitter, but rather a hormone. And so the hypothalamus, which is the part of your brain which mediates between your nervous system, so the electrical, pulses firing along your brain and your spine or whatever, so the nervous system, and the endocrine system, which is where you have hormones being secreted into your bloodstream, targeting cells or organs around the body. The hypothalamus is the part of the brain that mediates between those two systems. And they've found that the hypothalamus is deeply innervated and connected with the frontal lobe and with the limbic structure, so the evolved forethought part of your brain and the emotional center. And therefore, your hypothalamus, its activity is mediated by these two parts of the brain. And this shows that you're literally scientifically, not, sure, bullshit, your mental state directly affects your endocrine system, which affects bodily function, and immune system, etc., etc. So yeah, we're gonna dig into some cool stuff very, very soon. Glad to be posting again, and yeah, hope you enjoyed.